I don't know if that's a clear enough answer, but if you have any questions, let me know.
Um, COVID-19 has thrown a wrench in the works for already stretched publicly funded school. How would you work to resolve those issues in short education funding in Colorado?
Well, as a parent who is currently trying to balance online schooling and running for office and pretty much everything else, I can see the shortfalls and I can see the limits and I can see how difficult it is for children and for parents, especially right now, but especially children. I think that children are really stretched. I have an 8-year-old and he's really struggling. I think we need to really tackle Gallagher and Tabor, and we need to take them apart at the state level. And we need to have the funds to fund our education system. Not as, and I'm not saying that as a Democrat, I'm saying that as a citizen, as a parent. The one thing we can do to build our economy as strong as possible is to protect the space for the wage earning generation of our country. And we're not doing that in this country. And we're doing a really very poor job of that, honestly. So protecting public education and ensuring that our kids have decent public education after COVID. The funding piece, though, really has to come down to our public funding and Tabor and Gallagher.
That's actually our next question. What is your take on Gallagher?
I think Gallagher and Tabor both kneecap our state, and I've heard Republicans, especially behind closed doors, say that. They've got some ideas because Tabor has a real sexy name, but I can tell you that its writer by far has not a lot of real sexy ideas because he's pretty much left a stream of neglect, not just from his own sort of personal dealings within our county and the houses that he rents out and leaves to fall apart, but he's also done the same thing with our county. And quite honestly, if we are to invest in our culture, our future, and our county, and if we're being fiscally responsible, then we need to be really, really clear that we are protecting the infrastructure and investing in infrastructure, because as things fall apart, they're not getting fixed. And so what we do is we do like a two-way tax where we're taxing on top of taxing, or we're doing PIFs and TIFs and putting it on top of homeowners. And people end up paying a lot more because we don't have anything sensible, and because Republicans are afraid of funding things in a way that actually takes care of things, and in a way that stewards them for the future, and in a way that invests in our infrastructure so we're not putting a massive burden on our children. And I don't think that's a Republican idea or a Democratic idea. I think that's part of being a citizen, and it's incredibly important to take care of things so we're not burdening our children, which we already are.
How would you address the anticipated eviction crisis to help keep Coloradans in their homes?
Well, there have been a few attempts at that. I know some of the stays on evictions, and in other places, I think that raising rents and things like that, there have been some things like that. But I do think that with COVID especially, we're going to see some really unprecedented numbers of people who are more and more people who are vulnerable, more and more people who are homeless. We do not have enough affordable housing, and we have a real dearth right now in protecting people and protecting our most vulnerable. So the first thing is ensuring that people can't be evicted. And especially elderly people. I mean, if you see the homeless population, it has transformed pretty significantly over the last, at least the last 4 years, if not the last 6 years. We didn't have a huge homeless population about 6 years ago, and we do now, quite obviously. And that population, there's more and more elderly, there are more and more children, there are more and more families, and there are more and more people who are trying to do all of those things simultaneously. And I think we've got to do a pretty broad, deep dig to ensure that we're not just dumping everyone in the lower classes onto the streets. And so that, I think, an eviction stay where you can't evict people, and then also like a hold on raising rents is really important.
What are your priorities if you are elected?
Well, priorities, it's funny because as a Democratic Party chair, we would hold our second Tuesdays at the IBEW, and more people were showing up. And we had 120 people at one of our last ones on our second Tuesdays. And obviously now we can't do that in person. But people's issues before COVID were climate change. That was the number one issue that came up over and over and over and over again. And I think that now with COVID, the issues have shifted. The issues have shifted to what you just mentioned, housing. The issues have shifted to economic issues because many people, especially service workers, not service people, but service workers who are depending on the public really, and hospitality and things like that, of which we have many people in the state, have just fallen through the cracks because we have nothing to support them. The other issue is healthcare. And education. Education is a massive issue right now under COVID. So I think my issue still, for me, my real long range issue really has to be climate change. I mean, we have 10 years right now with what we have with the carbon crisis, and we cannot really accelerate what we need to do quick enough. We need to do healthy soils. We need to take care of our forests. Quite honestly, if you see that the majority of the West is burning and the fires that we have had and continue to have. And yet, after all of these fires in Colorado, I grew up in Huerfano County, and we had the spring fire. I was a national delegate at the DNC last week, and I was at my dad's house, and he's a volunteer firefighter, and he's 75, and he was out on the mountain all night putting out a tree that got hit by lightning that, he got the next day. He came home for 2 hours, and we have to have people like that. They're all volunteer though, just like me with the Democratic Party stuff. But my issue really still is climate, and we need to have regenerative forestry policy. But we need to also be dealing with things like transit to get people around. Now, transit and COVID, that's a weird combination right now because obviously those things are a little bit different, but we need to, I think closing Drake is one of the best things that we could have done for our community. But we need to keep doing things, and that's not, that's something that represents everybody. It's just like COVID. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. The reality is that bad air quality affects everybody. All of those things, a lack of water in the West and planning without water affects all of us. So climate change is my number one issue, but I think that really needs to shift in COVID. And in COVID right now, we really have to work on the budget. We have to work on education. We have to work on healthcare. We have to work on economic issues. And the economic issues can really be combined with the climate change issues by bringing back some local jobs, local manufacturing, and supply chains that are based in Colorado, including local foods, which we're not in a position to feed our communities in a crisis because we depend so heavily on a global consumer market that should we ever have to depend solely on feeding ourselves locally, we couldn't do it. So I think we need to change some of those shifts and help local agriculture, help local foods, and work on regenerative forestry and things like that. So my heart is still with climate change, but I do have to say with COVID, there are some issues that need to be addressed immediately, and those may take first priority just to keep people out of trouble.
What makes you better qualified than your opponent for this race, for this seat?
I don't know about better qualified. I think the difference is that right now what's going on in the Republican Party is they're towing the line. They're not representing everybody. And I think the broad-based approach of listening to constituents and not thinking that you're that you're representing just a party. You're representing everyone, and you're representing issues that impact and affect everyone. And those issues range from, you know, how we fund our roads and how we fund our education, how we fund all the things we do together, to the air that we breathe. I mean, we, as a representative, the burden and weight of protecting a community is the number one priority for me anyway. And I think that it's not about the person representing at all. It's about that job and really bearing the weight of making sure that you're representing people and their interests are served, and you're doing the very best job that you can for your district. So.
Do you think bipartisanship is important? And if so, how would you reach across the aisle?
I think bipartisanship is important. I think like what I just said about representation, you're representing everybody. You're not representing, you're even representing people who can't vote. I mean, man, you are representing across the entire spectrum. That's how it works. That's what representing is. And I think that you've got to get anything passed. And within the politicking environment, Drake is a prime example of that. The reason Drake closed is because, or the reason that there is a plan in place is because it makes economic sense. And the reality is, burning our forests versus protecting our communities actually makes more economic sense if you look at the entire cost of it. So to me, reaching across the aisle isn't a radical idea. It's listening to people and finding some civility and some humanity. And to me, that is the point of being in the public eye, is literally reaching across and connecting to people on a human level and not just towing a party line.
One of your goals is addressing child abuse and teen suicide. How would you do that?
Well, there is a task force actually that was set up. I don't think anything's been done with it since then. You know, El Paso County has one of the highest rates of teen suicide in the country. And to me, that's a very, very personal issue. My mother shot herself when I was 18 months old, and I have lived really with the consequences of gun violence and of my mother was only 21 when she died. But I have lived with the consequences of that my entire life. And it's something that needs to be radically addressed, especially today in the environment that we're living in. To think that, you know, just because kids aren't in school and you can't see what's going on in their homes means that they're better off is just absolute oblivion. The fact is that there is an increased rate of everything from child trafficking to major child depression right now. And mental health is another issue with COVID that really needs to be addressed. And so there was initially, I think Sally, County Commissioner Sally, what was her last name now? I'm sorry, I'm having a total...
You're not the only one.
I've been dealing with...
Clark.
Yeah. Sally Clark. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to remember her last name. I knew it was like a, you know, like Johnson, Clark, Smith, something like that. Sally Clark. She set up with Dan May a task force that I attended on a number of occasions, and I haven't seen anything from that since then, where a number of different agencies came together and started really addressing the issue of teen suicide. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to address it. I mean, quite honestly, we're living in a pretty dystopian reality, and to think that kids are just going to be okay by sucking it up is a complete disconnect. We have got to use the tools we have to reach out to kids, and especially in districts like D20, where we have the highest rate of teen suicide and things of that nature, where kids need to feel like they have space to be who they are. And it's beyond that too. It's not just space to be who you are. It's a lot of other things. I mean, the fact that public education doesn't have the outlets that it had before, and the fact that currently, right now, public education doesn't even have the camaraderie of connection because of COVID. So I think that there's a lot that could be done. A task force is one of the pieces and ways. I think with anything, and the way that I like to lead is to create teams of people who know a lot more than I do and put them together and try to lead them in a way that those ideas become kind of fertile ground for everybody to grow from.
How would you assist small businesses impacted by the coronavirus?
Well, there's a number of different things that we could do. I mean, honestly, if you look at where we are right now, the businesses that are really suffering, there's a massive number of service businesses that are really impacted. And I can tell you from right now, my car just got completely destroyed by hail. So um, I'm up in Louisville at my sister's house, and just got another car. And every town that you drive through has every part of their main street uh, closed down and fenced off, with the outside of the restaurants are basically on the outside. Have we done that? No, we haven't entirely done that. We could start by doing some decent urban design and planning and giving restaurants space for that, but that takes political will to do something like that and turn the outside inside. I mean, one of the things that they found with coronavirus is, you know, open air doesn't transmit things as much, right? So that's, we don't know a ton, but we know at least that. So 6 feet of distancing, open air, would make things a little bit easier for some of those service industries. I know small businesses are really suffering as well. I know even just small open kind of space where setting up like the public market, what they've done with Calgary, what at Ranch Foods Directs, and doing things of that nature, where you're supporting small business and you have it timed so people can come in and they're not infecting people, and you've got a really good system. I think that there's a number of things we can do for those types of things. But I think really one of the major things right now with small businesses is figuring out how to balance childcare, homeschooling, and parenting, and working. You know, my generation can't have a single breadwinner. You have to both be working to deal with student loans, to deal with healthcare, to deal with housing, to deal with childcare, to deal with all those things. And it's really hard to balance parenting and childcare and working from home. So creating some systems that help with that, with, you know, whether it's like, you know, I don't know, little pods, or like, I don't know, with that kind of healthcare with COVID, it really changes the dynamic pretty substantially. But the online presence is helpful for a lot of people. I think some people have been able to do things remotely pretty well. But those types of things, I would say, I think in the long term, what I'd like to see is bringing more of our sourcing and supply chains back to Colorado, so that, you know, we have, instead of getting, for instance, I work in the building industry. So if I want to get Carrara marble, or not Carrara marble, but marble from Marble, Colorado, to get that piece of marble for a house that I'm designing or building, the cheapest way is to have it shipped to India, or to have it shipped to Italy, to have it processed and then sent back, so it's slabbed up and it's finished. And the same thing happens with our meat packing plants. I mean, we have everything shipped. We don't have small producers who are able to do that. So I would say really looking at local supply chains. I would say opening up the inside to the outside as an immediate solution for service industry things. And I would say helping parents navigate the reality of working from home, and you know, maybe off hours or things of that nature.
You've said you are in favor of smart, what did it say? Smart development. What does that look like?
Well, that looks like developing in areas where you have the resources to sustain the development. So for instance, not putting up development where you don't have the water for the development over the long haul. So if you don't have the resources, you shouldn't be doing the development in those areas, but doing some redevelopment in downtown areas and bringing the cores kind of back into the community, into the city, and developing brownfield areas and redeveloping things, as well as providing like more affordable housing. So smart development are kind of layers of small businesses, local businesses, not just huge box stores, making spaces available that are more affordable for small businesses like graphic designers, or, you know, small retail, or, you know, like small restaurants or small type of things, where, or one-man shops, where you can have a small business and that money stays within that economy, so it's not being shipped away like a big box store, for kind of Main Street development, so people don't have to drive every single place. So part of smart development has to do with walkability, it has to do with people-oriented design, it has to do with transit-oriented design, it has to do with designing around hubs, it has to do with making sure that there are spaces for multi-generations so that elderly people are safe to walk around, and there's places for kids to play, there's green space, there's a whole bunch of different layers to smart development. But I think the number one thing in the West is really developing things with the resources that you have to sustain the development over time, and not just putting the costs back on that homeowner with PIFs or TIFs for special districts.
So there's been a lot of social justice marches and civil rights issues nationwide, but also in Colorado and Colorado Springs. How would you start to work on some of those systemic issues that affect different races and ethnicities in Colorado Springs?
Well, the issue has been specifically, I mean, from what I've seen, is violence within police officer, you know, within the police force against citizens in ways that are really destructive to the communities. I think that there have been a lot of instances, and there are a lot of precedents that we can look at for effective policing. And one of those things is having police officers work in the communities that they live in. So it's not a police officer working in a different district or a different community, but literally having that police officer as a peace officer within his community. I do not think having social workers show up at a domestic violence scene or at a scene where there's, you know, human trafficking or sex trafficking is safe, either for the people who are being trafficked or abused, or for the social worker. So I do think effective policing, when it's done with empathy, can keep a community safe. But I think that it needs to be done where you are literally policing within the communities that serving within the community that you live. I think that a unit that is like a citizens oversight unit is a really important piece. I know that there have been a lot of things within the Colorado Springs Police Department and the Sheriff's Department, like the Fight Club and all of those types of things, that are pretty appalling, and things like that that are real gross injustice and abuse of power need to be called out. I know that there's still factions within the police department and within the sheriff's office, still with Makita's people and elders people, and there's still factions. And there shouldn't be that. They should be literally training to serve as peace officers and police officers within their communities. I think that there needs to be a space for more of an elevated voice, where people in various communities need to have their voices heard and have spaces heard. I think also within those issues, like in difficult communities, when I first came to Colorado Springs, I worked with a woman named Zenga, who we did an after-school program at the Citadel Mall for very at-risk youth. And I think doing those kinds of programs are really important. And Sangha Nagudi, who I worked with, she's an artist, and she's one of my favorite people. She's amazing. But doing that kind of after-school program and giving kids space to go, and maybe combining those pieces. Also, I think doing ride-alongs with police officers by community members is really important, because I think there needs to be both of those types of understanding of where people come from. But I think police officers really need to be from the communities that they are serving and protecting, so that they have that sense that they are protecting that specific community, and that's their role. So.
Okay. Do any of you have any follow-up questions? Okay. Electra, would you like anything to wrap up?
I don't. I'm in it for the long haul. If not this race, then another, and I'm in it for the long haul to flip this county and community into more of a grassroots community. And I'm in it because I'm I'm a scrapper and a fighter, and I'm willing to put in the time and energy to make a difference here. And that's what's important to me. So I really appreciate your time and what you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time today. These will go up with our endorsements, which should be out the first week of October. So
Okay.
thank you much.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to do between here and there. I've got all my 400 yard signs or whatever to put up. So I've been focusing on the county, and now it's time to focus on my race for a little bit. I felt like people were a little too burnt out to pay attention to any more input. And then basically the last 2 months is going to be pretty full on. So I sort of pulled back to just, you know, do things more intensely at the end. I think that's good. So hopefully we'll turn things around. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Electra.
Thank you. Bye.